In the final weeks of the war, when maps were changing faster than orders could be written, the German army commander stationed near the transit town simply vanished. It happened quietly, without gunfire, without witnesses, without a final message. One day he was there, his name stamped across supply forms, his signature on requisition slips, his authority unquestioned. The next day, his office sat unlocked, his desk cleared only of paperwork already filed, his presence erased as if he had stepped out briefly and never returned. The town itself was not remarkable, but its location was. Rail lines converged there, roads fed through it toward the interior, and for years it had been a logistical artery for troops moving east and west. By early spring of 1945, that artery was collapsing. German units were retreating in fragments, Allied forces were advancing from multiple directions, and communication between command posts was unreliable at best. Orders contradicted each other. Units moved without coordination. Entire battalions surrendered without firing a shot, while others disintegrated into civilians trying to disappear. In that chaos, disappearances were common. Soldiers deserted, officers were captured, some were killed and never identified. So when the commander failed to report for a scheduled briefing, no immediate alarm was raised. His staff assumed he had been pulled into an emergency meeting or had gone to inspect positions along the rail corridor. Hours passed, then a full day. Still, no one went looking. The chain of command was already fractured and authority shifted by the hour. When his absence could no longer be ignored, the situation was documented with bureaucratic efficiency. A brief notation was entered into a unit log stating that the commander was unaccounted for during ongoing withdrawal operations. It was language designed to close a file without opening an investigation. No date of death, no confirmation of capture, just missing. What made the disappearance strange was not that it happened, but how little evidence it left behind. His quarters showed no sign of haste. His uniform remained folded in a trunk. Personal items, photographs, letters, a small leather notebook were still there. His sidearm had not been taken. His vehicle, a staff car assigned exclusively to him, was found parked behind the headquarters building with the keys inside. It had not been sabotaged or damaged. It looked as though it had been deliberately left. No one reported seeing him flee. No one recalled him joining retreating columns or attempting to blend in with civilians. Allied units that swept through the area days later did not list him among captured officers. Interrogation records from prisoners taken nearby contained no mention of him. For someone of his rank, that absence was notable. High-ranking officers were valuable intelligence assets, and their capture was usually recorded carefully. The explanation offered, lost during chaotic retreat, was convenient and on the surface reasonable. The war was ending violently and unevenly. Records were incomplete, but even amid disorder, patterns existed. Commanders issued final orders. They attempted to regroup. They surrendered formally or tried to escape west. This commander did none of that, or at least left no trace that he had. As Allied forces advanced, the headquarters was abandoned. Files were seized, maps confiscated, and remaining personnel were processed as prisoners of war. The commander's name appeared on a list of missing officers compiled weeks later, grouped alongside dozens of others. No distinction was made. No inquiry followed. Intelligence officers were overwhelmed with larger priorities, tracking fleeing leadership, locating war crimes evidence, stabilizing occupied zones. One missing commander from a collapsing unit did not rise to the level of concern. Locally, however, the disappearance did not go unnoticed. A handful of townspeople had seen the commander regularly over the previous years. He was known by sight, if not by name. He walked through town with measured routine, visited municipal offices, spoke to local administrators. Then abruptly he was gone. No public surrender, no arrest, no body, just absence. In the days after the town fell under Allied control, rumors circulated quietly. Some believed he had been killed and buried hastily by retreating troops. Others claimed he had escaped in civilian clothes, though no one could say when or how. A few suggested he had been taken by Soviet forces farther east, swallowed into a system where names disappeared. But these were assumptions, not based on observation. The official record remained thin. A single-page military summary listed his status as unknown. Allied intelligence files mentioned him only in passing, noting that his disappearance coincided with the collapse of regional command structures. There was no follow-up, no annotation suggesting suspicion or unresolved questions. His case was not assigned to any investigative unit. It did not become a priority. It did not even become a mystery in any formal sense. What was left behind was silence, and silence is easy to file away during war. The town rebuilt. The headquarters building was repurposed. New authorities took over administration. People moved on because they had to. The commander's name faded from conversation. Years passed, then decades. Yet the absence lingered in small ways. Older residents remembered that his belongings had never been recovered. Some recalled that his staff had seemed confused rather than panicked when he failed to appear, as if they believed he would return. A former clerk later remarked that there had been no emergency orders issued in his absence, no frantic attempts to locate him, which was unusual for a commander at that level. Still, nothing came of it. Without evidence, memory alone could not sustain an investigation. The war generated millions of missing persons, and his case blended into that vast, unresolved mass. He became a footnote, a name on a list, a line in a report written by someone already thinking about the next crisis. What no one could explain, and what no one seriously attempted to explain, was how a man in that position could disappear so completely without leaving even the faintest trail. No witnesses, no confirmed sightings, no remains, no capture record, just a room left as it was, a car parked neatly, and a war that moved on without looking back. As the years passed and archives slowly opened, historians would begin to notice small inconsistencies in the surviving paperwork, dates that did not align, references that went nowhere, mentions of requisition buildings and secured areas that seemed excessive for a retreating force. At the time, none of this mattered. The disappearance had already slipped into obscurity, protected by the sheer scale of history. And yet, beneath that silence, the unanswered question remained. Not how the commander died, but whether he ever left at all. For decades after the war ended, the commander's disappearance existed only as a thin line in a registry of missing officers, buried among thousands of similar entries. It attracted no attention, inspired no books, and generated no official questions. Then, quietly much later, it resurfaced, not because someone went looking for him, but because the past itself began to open in fragments. In the 1980s and 1990s, as governments started declassifying wartime intelligence files, historians and archivists began the slow, methodical work of revisiting unresolved cases. Most of the material was dry. Interrogation transcripts, transport logs, requisition forms, administrative correspondence that had once been stamped secret and then forgotten. It was during this process that the commander's name began to appear again, scattered across documents that did not quite align with the story that had been accepted for so long. At first, the mention seemed insignificant. His name appeared in Allied interrogation summaries of captured German officials who had served in the same region. These summaries were heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out, names replaced with initials or removed altogether. Still, the commander's rank and posting were referenced repeatedly, often in contexts that had nothing to do with battlefield operations. Instead, they were tied to civilian buildings, municipal cooperation, and the requisitioning of local infrastructure during the final months of the war. One file in particular stood out. It was an Allied intelligence report compiled months after the town had been secured, summarizing information gathered from multiple interrogations. The commander was listed not as missing, but as last known coordinating non-combat logistical arrangements. The phrase was vague, but it suggested activity beyond troop movements. The report did not explain what those arrangements were, only that they involved secured facilities and restricted access zones within the town. German administrative logs told a similar story. Late-war paperwork from regional authorities, preserved in state archives, showed a flurry of approvals signed under emergency authority. Buildings were requisitioned for temporary use. Materials were diverted from standard supply chains, and construction work was authorized without clear justification. In several of these documents, the commander's name appeared in the approval chain, sometimes as the initiating authority, sometimes as the final sign-off. What was missing from these records was just as telling. There were no corresponding documents releasing those buildings back to civilian use, no follow-up inspections, no termination orders. It was as if the paper trail simply stopped, frozen in the moment the war collapsed. As historians compared these files to the accepted narrative of the commander's disappearance, contradictions became impossible to ignore. If he had vanished during retreat, how had his name continued to appear in administrative matters that extended to the very end of hostilities? If he had been killed or captured, who had been authorizing the transfer of materials and securing of buildings in his name? At the same time, local oral histories were being collected by regional museums and historical societies. These interviews, recorded decades after the events, were often unreliable in detail but consistent in tone. Older residents spoke of an uneasy period near the end of the war, when activity in the town did not match the outward signs of collapse. They recalled trucks moving at night, lights on in buildings that were supposedly abandoned, and German personnel enforcing restricted zones even as authority elsewhere disintegrated. One building came up again and again in these accounts, a municipal structure that would later become the town's public library. During the occupation, it had served various administrative functions, though records of its exact use were incomplete. Several interviewees remembered that, unlike other buildings, it remained guarded until the very last days before Allied forces arrived. Even then, it was not looted or destroyed. It was sealed. People remembered unusual details: deliveries arriving after curfew, doors opening briefly in the early hours of the morning, sounds of work being done when most of the town was dark. None of these memories were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern that stood apart from the chaos elsewhere. For years, these stories were dismissed as the blending of memory and rumor, shaped by fear and time. But when historians cross-referenced them with the newly accessible documents, the overlap was unsettling. The requisition orders matched the timeframes locals described. The materials transferred, cement, steel supports, ventilation components, did not align with battlefield needs. They aligned with construction. The commander's role in this activity remained unclear, but his presence in the paperwork was undeniable. He had been involved in organizing something stationary, something fixed in place, at a time when most of the German command structure was preparing to move or surrender. It suggested intent, planning, and a timeline that extended beyond the immediate collapse of the front. Allied interrogation summaries added another layer of ambiguity. In several transcripts, former German officials were asked directly about the commander. Their answers were evasive. Some claimed not to know his fate. Others said they believed he had been reassigned, though no orders supported that claim. One transcript included a note from an Allied officer stating that the interviewee appears reluctant to discuss subjects' final activities. Why that reluctance existed was never explained. It could have been loyalty. It could have been fear of reprisal. Or it could have been that the truth did not fit neatly into the categories the interrogators were prepared to document. As more files were reviewed, the possibility emerged that the commander had not vanished during retreat at all. Instead, he may have been deliberately removed from the visible collapse of the war, positioned somewhere stable as the world around him fell apart. The idea was uncomfortable and, for a long time, unspoken. It challenged the assumption that disappearance equaled death or capture. The library building itself became a focal point for renewed curiosity. Renovation records from the post-war period show that when the structure was converted for public use, certain areas were left untouched. Blueprints were altered, subfloor spaces were filled in without documentation, and maintenance reports noted inaccessible sections that were deemed structurally irrelevant. At the time, this was attributed to cost-saving measures and post-war shortages. No one questioned it. To the people who worked there decades later, these details meant nothing. The building was quiet, orderly, and unremarkable. But to those comparing records and memories, it began to look like a place designed to conceal rather than serve. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, through footnotes and marginalia, through half-remembered stories and redacted pages. Each piece alone could be dismissed. Together, they suggested something more deliberate than chaos. They suggested that while the war ended violently above ground, something else was being secured below the surface. By the time historians began to speak openly about the contradictions, the commander's disappearance had taken on a new shape. It was no longer a question of where he went during retreat, but whether he ever left the town at all. The records did not prove that he stayed, but they made it increasingly difficult to believe that he had simply vanished into the noise of history. And beneath the quiet aisles of a public library, long stripped of its past and repurposed for peace, the unanswered question lingered, waiting for something solid, something physical, to finally bring the hidden story into the light. The building stood in the center of town, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of place people passed every day without a second thought. For decades, it had been known simply as the public library, a place of order, silence, and routine. Shelves aligned neatly, reading tables worn smooth by time, children's drawings pinned to bulletin boards. Nothing about it suggested secrecy or fear. And yet, its history did not begin as cleanly as its appearance implied. The library had been constructed in the years immediately following the war, during a period when the town was still recovering from damage, shortages, and loss. Official records described it as a civic renewal project, built on the footprint of a municipal structure that had been partially destroyed during the final phase of fighting. That explanation satisfied most people. After all, rebuilding was happening everywhere. Old buildings were repurposed or replaced quickly, often with limited documentation. But when historians and investigators began to look more closely, the story of the building started to fracture. Municipal archives showed that the decision to build a library on that specific site was made unusually fast. Approval was granted before a full damage assessment had been completed. Funding was allocated despite other, more urgent needs in the town. The design plans were finalized quickly, using a combination of new drawings and modified pre-war schematics. On paper, it all looked efficient. In reality, it raised questions. The foundation work was the first anomaly. Construction reports indicated that large sections of the original substructure were left in place rather than removed, even though demolition would have been standard practice. Engineers reinforced these areas instead of clearing them, pouring new concrete around old supports and sealing off spaces that were no longer accessible. The justification given was cost and time. The town needed a functioning public building, and resources were limited. Yet the reinforcements went far beyond what was necessary for stability. Load-bearing elements were overbuilt, walls were thicker than required. Floor slabs were poured with unusual depth in certain sections, particularly in the central wing of the building. These choices were expensive and labor-intensive, not the kind of decisions made lightly in a period of scarcity. Then there were the stairwells. Early blueprints showed multiple access points between floors, including a service stair that would have connected the ground level to the basement. In the final construction, that stairwell simply did not exist. It was not relocated. It was sealed. The space where it should have been was filled in, labeled in later plans as structural support. For decades, no one questioned it. Former librarians, interviewed years later, described small things that never quite made sense but were easy to ignore. Certain areas of the building were always colder, regardless of the season. Radiators functioned unevenly, with entire sections resisting adjustment. Some rooms felt damp even when humidity levels were normal elsewhere. Maintenance requests were filed, then closed, often with vague explanations. Maintenance workers noticed inconsistencies too. Blueprints rarely matched what they found behind walls or beneath floors. Pipes ran in unexpected directions. Electrical conduits disappeared into sealed spaces. When renovations were carried out, contractors were instructed not to disturb certain sections of the foundation. The reasons were never fully explained, only passed down as institutional memory. Don't touch that area, it's not necessary. It's not worth the trouble. One retired custodian recalled a storage room that was always locked, even though it held nothing of value. The key was kept separately, and access required approval that was almost never granted. When asked why, supervisors cited safety concerns and structural issues. Over time, the explanation became routine, and the curiosity faded. What no one could explain was the subfloor cavity. Construction notes from the late 1940s referenced existing void space, a term used to describe an area beneath the main floor that was not part of the new design. The notes stated that the space was filled with debris and sealed for stability. There was no detailed survey, no measurements, no photographs, just a decision to close it off and move on. For decades, that decision went unchallenged. It was only when modern investigators began comparing wartime requisition records with post-war construction documents that the tension became unavoidable. The materials diverted during the final months of the war, cement, steel supports, ventilation components, matched the kind of work that appeared to have been done beneath the library. Not battlefield fortifications, not defensive positions, something enclosed, something hidden. The timeline mattered. The requisition orders were signed before the town fell. The construction reinforcements were poured after, which meant whatever existed beneath the building had been planned during the war and preserved afterward. As this realization took shape, the building itself seemed to shift in meaning. What had once been seen as a symbol of recovery now looked more like a cover, a quiet continuation of unfinished business. The choice to build a library there, of all places, felt deliberate. A public space, a place of trust, a building that would rarely be excavated or questioned. Investigators walked the floors with new eyes. They noted how shelving units aligned precisely over reinforced sections, how the heaviest bookcases sat above the thickest slabs of concrete, how certain areas had never been renovated, even during major updates, as if preserving an underlying structure took priority over modernization. Former staff members, when confronted with these details, expressed disbelief mixed with unease. Many had spent years in the building without ever considering its past. Some described an unshakable feeling that parts of the library were off-limits in ways that went beyond policy. Not forbidden, exactly, just discouraged. No one had ever found anything. No hidden doors, no obvious entrances, and that absence was part of what made the situation unsettling. If something had been concealed there, it had been done carefully, professionally, and with the expectation that it would remain hidden indefinitely. The question was no longer whether the building concealed something unusual. The question was who had designed it that way, and why. The commander's name lingered in the background of every document review. His authority overlapped with the requisition orders. His disappearance coincided with the final sealing of records. His absence from the visible collapse of the war now felt less like chance and more like intention. As investigators reached the limits of what paper records could reveal, attention turned fully to the structure itself. The reinforced foundations, the sealed stairwells, the unexplained cavity beneath the floor, all of it pointed toward a physical truth that had never been examined. If answers existed, They were no longer in archives or memories. They were locked beneath a building that had spent decades pretending to be ordinary, waiting for someone to finally look beneath the surface. The discovery did not begin with suspicion or intent. It began the way most long-buried truths do, by accident, during work meant to preserve the present, not interrogate the past. The library was undergoing a routine restoration, the kind scheduled every few decades to reinforce aging structures and update safety standards. Shelving units that had stood in the same place since the building opened were being carefully removed so the flooring beneath could be reinforced. The process was slow and methodical. Books were cataloged, boxed, and moved section by section. Nothing about the project suggested it would become anything more than an administrative inconvenience. Then workers reached a section of shelving near the center of the building that resisted removal. The bolts anchoring it to the floor were heavier than expected. When they finally gave way, the shelving shifted just enough to expose something no one had seen before. A metal panel set flush into the floor, sealed beneath layers of old varnish and dust. At first, it was assumed to be an access hatch for utilities, perhaps an outdated heating system or storage void left from early construction. But when maintenance staff attempted to open it, they found it welded shut from the inside. There were no visible hinges, no handles, only a narrow seam around the edges and a faint outline suggesting deliberate concealment. Library administration halted the renovation immediately. Local authorities were notified, not out of fear, but protocol. Any unknown structural space beneath a public building raised safety concerns. Within hours, the site was secured, and a small team from municipal engineering and local police arrived to assess the situation. Cutting through the seal took time. The metal was thicker than modern standards required. Beneath it was reinforced concrete, poured in layers, not rubble or debris as decades-old notes had claimed. When an opening was finally made, it revealed a vertical shaft descending into darkness, fitted with an old metal ladder bolted into the wall. The air that rose from below was stale but not foul. There was no immediate sign of collapse or flooding. What was clear, even before anyone descended, was that this space had been intentionally built, not accidentally preserved. Specialists were called in, structural engineers, fire safety officials, eventually police investigators. When they finally entered the space below, they found a sealed room, rectangular, compact, and meticulously constructed. The walls were reinforced concrete. The ceiling was supported by steel beams. The door through which they entered had been designed to close from the outside and disappear beneath flooring and fixtures above. Inside, the room was silent, preserved in a way that felt unnatural. Along one wall were shelves holding documents wrapped in oilcloth, stacked carefully and protected from moisture. Many bore official stamps from the final years of the war. Maps, administrative orders, correspondence, all dated and signed. Some carried the commander's name. Others referenced logistical arrangements that had never appeared in any known archive. Personal effects were arranged with equal care. A military uniform folded and sealed, insignia wrapped separately. Civilian clothing hung neatly on hooks. A pair of worn boots rested beneath a small cot. Nearby, ration containers were stacked in rows, some empty, others still sealed. The labels dated back to wartime production runs, but several bore markings indicating post-war manufacture. That detail changed everything. The room was not a temporary hiding place. It was not a panic shelter built in desperation. It was a living space, designed for long-term occupation. Ventilation ducts had been carved discreetly into the structure, channeling air upward through walls and out through vents that blended seamlessly into the building above. Water had been stored in sealed containers, some refilled over time. A small hand-powered generator sat against one wall, unused but functional. Forensic teams documented every inch before anything was removed. The process was slow, cautious, almost reverent. This was no longer a renovation issue. It was a historical and criminal investigation unfolding in real time. The documents were cataloged first. Paper analysis confirmed they had been handled repeatedly over years. Ink dating placed some entries well after the official surrender. Notes written in the same hand referenced events that occurred during the occupation period and then continued into the early post-war years. Mentions of food shortages, broadcasts heard over a radio, political developments recorded from memory. The personal items told a quieter story: wear patterns on the cot, repairs made to clothing. The boots showed signs of use long after the war should have ended. Small carvings on the wall marked the passing of time, not days or weeks, but years. There were no remains. That absence was as unsettling as the discovery itself. Whoever had lived there had eventually left or been helped out. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of sudden death. The space had been cleaned, organized, and sealed deliberately. It looked like a place someone had chosen to abandon, not a tomb. Police procedures followed established protocols. The site was treated as a potential crime scene. Access was restricted. Items were removed only after exhaustive documentation. Chain of custody procedures were followed with precision. This was not treated as a curiosity or a historical footnote. It was treated as evidence. Historians were brought in to authenticate the materials. Military experts confirmed the insignia matched the missing commander's rank and unit. Handwriting analysis linked several documents directly to him. The consistency was undeniable. Forensic dating placed the latest activity in the room several years after the war had ended. Dust patterns indicated the space had remained sealed for decades after that. Whatever decision had been made, to leave, to disappear completely, it had been final. The realization settled slowly among the investigators. While the town rebuilt above, while borders shifted and governments formed, someone had been living beneath a public library, listening to the world change through the filtered sounds of daily life overhead. Children learning to read, chairs scraping across floors, quiet conversations, all of it happening just meters away from someone who officially no longer existed. The implications were staggering. The commander had not vanished during retreat. He had survived the war in hiding by design. He had prepared for it, planned it, and executed it with precision. Yet the most haunting question remained unanswered. How long had he stayed, and how had he finally left? There were no signs of forced entry or exit, no tunnel leading away. The only access point was the one just discovered, sealed from above, which meant that at some point someone else had to have been involved. Someone had opened the room. Someone had helped him leave, or at least known he was there. As investigators stood in the confined space, surrounded by evidence of a life lived in deliberate silence, the weight of it pressed in. This was not just a hidden room. It was proof of a choice, a refusal to face the world as it was, a decision to wait it out beneath the surface, trusting that time would erase responsibility. The room had done its job. It had hidden him while history moved on. And now, decades later, it had surfaced, not to answer every question but to confirm the most unsettling truth of all. The commander did not disappear into chaos. He lived through it, underground, while the world above forgot he was ever there. Once the initial shock of the discovery faded, the investigation shifted into a quieter, more unsettling phase. The room beneath the library had proven that the commander survived the collapse of the war, but survival alone did not explain what came next. The deeper question was why he chose this path, and how far ahead he had planned it. The documents found inside the room became the center of that search for intent. Among the official papers and administrative notes were several handwritten letters, carefully folded and stored separately, as if they held a different weight. None were addressed. None were sealed. They were written in a controlled, deliberate hand, with no indication they were ever meant to be sent. In these letters, the commander did not describe battlefield movements or military strategy. He wrote about fear, Not fear of death, but fear of judgment. He referenced post-war trials, the possibility of being made an example, and the growing sense that loyalty within the command structure was already unraveling. Superiors who had once demanded obedience were now disappearing, denying responsibility, or quietly preparing their own escapes. He wrote about betrayal in measured terms, noting how orders had grown vague, how accountability was shifting downward, and how officers like him were being left exposed. The letters suggested he no longer believed surrender would lead to fair treatment, nor that escape westward would guarantee safety. To him, every visible option ended the same way, with a cell, a courtroom, or a noose. The alternative he chose was not flight, but erasure. The room itself supported that conclusion. Investigators documented the food stockpiles with careful attention. The quantities were precise, calculated, and diversified. Canned goods, preserved grains, dried proteins, enough to sustain a single person for years if rationed carefully. Labels and manufacturing dates showed that supplies had been replenished over time, not stocked once and forgot. Someone had maintained this system, adjusting to shortages and availability. Air filtration modifications revealed the same level of foresight. The ventilation system was not improvised. It had been designed to operate quietly, drawing air through indirect channels that minimized sound and light. Filters had been replaced periodically, using materials available only after the war. That meant someone either accessed the space regularly or assisted from above. Civilian clothing found in the room added another layer. It was not generic or random. The styles changed subtly over time, reflecting post-war fashion rather than wartime necessity. Shoes were repaired, not discarded. Fabric patches matched materials common in the region during different years. Whoever lived there intended to emerge eventually, or at least remain prepared to do so. DNA analysis confirmed what the physical evidence already suggested. The room had been occupied long-term. Skin cells, hair fragments, and biological traces were consistent with a single primary occupant over many years. There was no evidence of multiple long-term residents. This was not a shared hiding place. It was solitary by design. Still, there were no remains. That absence forced investigators to confront a conclusion they had been circling since the room was opened. The commander did not die underground. At some point, he left. The question of how remained unresolved, but the letters hinted at possibility. In one passage, he wrote about patience, about waiting until the world above no longer remembers the face it wants to punish. He wrote about blending into ordinary life, about the safety of anonymity in post-war chaos. There was no mention of specific plans, no names, no routes, but the intent was clear. Survival was only the first phase. Psychologists consulted on the case described the mindset as extreme but not irrational given the circumstances. Prolonged isolation, combined with absolute control over one's environment, can reinforce resolve rather than erode it, especially when driven by fear of external consequences. The room was not a prison to him. It was a shield. The logistics supported that interpretation. Everything in the space was arranged to reduce reliance on others, yet not eliminate it entirely. Supplies that could not be produced underground, replacement filters, fresh water containers, updated clothing, suggested outside contact, even if minimal. The absence of any written acknowledgement of helpers pointed to secrecy enforced by mutual interest rather than trust. Investigators began examining civilian records from the post-war years. Employment roles, housing registries, food ration distributions. They searched for anomalies, individuals who appeared suddenly with incomplete documentation or whose backgrounds could not be fully verified. In the immediate aftermath of the war, such gaps were common. Entire populations were displaced. Paperwork was lost or falsified. Identity was fluid in ways it would never be again. Within that chaos, a man who waited long enough could disappear in plain sight. Local accounts took on new meaning. Stories of a quiet man who rented rooms briefly, of someone who avoided attention, moved frequently, and kept to himself. None of these accounts could be definitively linked to the commander, but none could rule him out either. Age progression estimates suggested he could have passed as an ordinary civilian within a few years of emerging. The possibility that civilians had assisted him was unavoidable. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or self-preservation, someone had known. Someone had kept silent. Investigators found no written proof of collaboration, but the physical reality of the room made denial impossible. Access from above required deliberate action. The hatch could not open itself. What made the case especially grim was how ordinary that silence may have been. In the post-war years, people were focused on survival, rebuilding, and forgetting. Many carried their own secrets. Helping one more person disappear, especially someone who did not ask questions and did not draw attention, may not have felt like a moral choice at all, but a practical one. As the investigation stretched on, it reached its limits. No fingerprints matched known records. No confirmed sightings could be substantiated. No burial sites were found. The commander had prepared for this outcome as carefully as he had prepared the room. He had removed himself not only from the war, but from history's ability to track him. What remained was the psychological weight of the discovery. The understanding that for years, perhaps decades, he lived beneath a public building while life continued above him. That he listened to footsteps, voices, celebrations, and grief, all while waiting for a moment when it was finally safe to exist again. The letters ended without closure. The last one spoke of readiness, of the belief that the time would come when the world would no longer be looking for him. There was no signature, no date, just the quiet confidence of someone who believed he had outweighed justice. And as investigators stood with the evidence laid out before them, documents, clothing, supplies, and silence, the realization settled in with quiet force. The commander had not fled in panic. He had not been lost to chaos. He had chosen disappearance as a strategy, executed it patiently, and most likely walked back into the world when he believed no one would recognize the man he had once been. The only question left was whether history would ever know where he went, or whether this hidden room was the closest it would ever come to finding him. By the time the investigation reached its final phase, there was no longer any debate about what had happened beneath the library. The question was no longer speculative or theoretical. It had become a matter of record, built slowly from archives, forensic data, and the physical reality of the hidden room itself. Archival cross-checks were conducted with a level of scrutiny rarely applied to cases this old. Wartime German records were matched against Allied intelligence summaries, municipal documents, and post-war reconstruction files. Dates were aligned. Signatures were compared. Gaps were examined rather than dismissed. When laid out together, the timeline told a story that no single document could convey on its own. The commander's official disappearance occurred weeks before the war ended in the region. Yet requisition orders bearing his authority continued beyond that point. Construction materials diverted during the final days of occupation match exactly what had been used to reinforce the space beneath the library. Municipal permits issued after liberation referenced pre-existing structural elements that were never fully documented. Maintenance logs from the 1950s and 1960s mentioned sealed areas that were not to be accessed. Each record alone could have been explained away. Together, they formed a continuous thread that ran from the last months of the war into the early years of peace. Forensic timelines strengthened that thread. Paper analysis of documents found in the room showed handling patterns that extended well past 1945. Ink composition dated some handwritten notes to years after the surrender. Food packaging and replacement filters could be traced to post-war manufacturers. Even the wear on the room itself, scratches on the floor, repairs to shelving, patches on clothing, spoke to long-term habitation rather than brief concealment. This was not a man hiding until the fighting stopped. This was a man who planned to outlast consequences. Municipal records released decades later filled in the final gaps. In the immediate post-war period, the town faced severe housing shortages. Refugees passed through. Displaced families settled temporarily. Identification documents were often incomplete or forged. Authorities prioritized stability over thorough vetting. Within that environment, a man emerging quietly, without drawing attention, could slip into civilian life with relative ease. There was no record of the commander's death, no burial, no obituary, no pension claim. His name did not appear in post-war arrest lists or war crimes proceedings. He simply ceased to exist as an official entity. The absence that had once been attributed to chaos now stood revealed as design. Investigators reached a consensus that surprised even them in its clarity. The commander had not vanished during retreat. He had stepped out of the visible world deliberately, retreating underground while the structures of power he served collapsed above him. He had waited through the most dangerous period, when trials were active, when memories were fresh, when vengeance and justice were still intertwined. And when enough time had passed, he had left. How he left remained unresolved, but the possibilities were limited and grounded. The hatch beneath the shelving could only be opened from above. Someone had access. Someone had moved the shelves back into place afterward. Whether that assistance came from a single individual or several over the years could not be determined. What was clear was that silence had been maintained. That silence was perhaps the most unsettling part of the story. There was no evidence of coercion, no signs of blackmail or threats. The assistance, if it existed, appeared quiet and voluntary. In the post-war years, fear did not disappear overnight. Loyalty did not vanish with uniforms. Some civilians had benefited from cooperation during the occupation. Others feared exposure of their own actions. Helping one man disappear may have felt like a way to keep the past buried, literally and figuratively. The investigation considered whether justice had failed, whether the commander had escaped accountability entirely. But that question resisted a simple answer. Justice requires confrontation, acknowledgement, and consequence. None of those occurred. The commander did not stand trial. He did not confess. He did not defend himself. He removed himself from the system that would have judged him. In doing so, he also removed any opportunity for closure. The library remained open throughout the investigation. Children continued to visit. Books continued to be borrowed. Life moved forward even as the building's past was stripped bare beneath the surface. When the examination concluded, authorities faced a decision. The room was documented, sealed, and left intact. There was no public access, no memorial, no display. The space returned to silence. Officials cited safety and preservation concerns, but the reasoning ran deeper. The room was not a place that offered resolution. It offered confirmation without comfort. Opening it to the public would not bring answers about where the commander went or who helped him. It would only underscore how easily history can be avoided. For the town, the revelation was difficult to process. Residents grappled with the idea that for years, perhaps decades, someone lived beneath a place they associated with learning, safety, and normalcy. That the routines of daily life unfolded just above a man actively hiding from the consequences of his actions. For historians, the case became a rare example of intentional disappearance carried out with patience rather than speed. Not an escape across borders or oceans, but a withdrawal into stillness. A bet that time itself would be the most reliable ally. And time, in the end, had delivered exactly what the commander seemed to expect. No definitive sightings were ever confirmed after the estimated date of his exit. No remains surfaced. No identity could be conclusively tied back to him. The world changed. Generations passed. Those who might have recognized him aged and died. Records fragmented. Memory softened. What the room finally proved was not just that he survived, but that survival was never the end goal. The goal was absence, to become unremarkable, to live without a past that could catch up. The commander's fate remains unknown. He may have lived out his life quietly under another name. He may have moved often, leaving little trace. He may have died alone, carrying his secret with him. The evidence cannot say. It only confirms that he succeeded in one crucial respect. He avoided history. Justice was neither served nor denied in the conventional sense. It was bypassed. The mechanisms designed to account for actions and assign responsibility were rendered irrelevant by time and concealment. The war ended. The world rebuilt. And one man waited underground until he believed it was safe to step back into the light. Today, the library stands as it always has. Its shelves rest above reinforced concrete. Its floors conceal a room most people will never see. The building continues to fulfill its purpose, offering knowledge without revealing everything it knows. And beneath it all lies the truth that took 80 years to surface. The commander did not vanish in chaos. He did not fall in battle or surrender in defeat. He hid, waited, and when the world finally stopped looking, he walked away, leaving behind a sealed room, unanswered questions, and a quiet reminder that some disappearances are not accidents but choices.